The mourning period for a husband is supposed to have an expiration date, or so the grief counselors told me. But 3 years after Mark's private plane vanished over the Pacific, I was still waking up reaching for a phantom warmth on the left side of the mattress. My friends finally staged an intervention, their faces etched with a mix of pity and frustration, as they forced me to download SoulLink, an elite dating app that claimed to use biological markers and deep psychology algorithms to find a molecular match. It did it just to silence them, uploading my data and setting my preferences to the widest possible margins, never expecting the screen to do anything other than scroll through a gallery of polite strangers. But on a rainy Tuesday, while I was nursing a lukewarm coffee, the app didn't just chirp, it screamed, with a golden notification banner I had never seen before. 99.9% match found. Biological synchrony detected. I clicked the profile, expecting to see a face that resonated with my soul. But the man staring back at me was a total stranger. A rugged, dark-haired man named Julian, with piercing green eyes that looked nothing like Mark's gentle hazel ones. Yet, as I scrolled down, the compatibility report made the blood drain from my face and the coffee cup slip from my trembling fingers, shattering on the tile. The app hadn't just matched our interests, it had cross-referenced his biometric data, and according to the encrypted SoulLink database, Julian possessed the exact unique fingerprint ridge patterns, the identical resting heart rate of 58 BPM, and a DNA sequence that was a 100% match to the man I had buried in an empty casket. It was biologically impossible, a scientific heresy that suggested my dead husband was walking around in another man's skin, and the terror of it was only eclipsed by a sudden, desperate hope that wouldn't stay dead. I messaged him with a shaking hand, a simple, "How is this possible?" that felt like a scream into a digital void, and the reply came back in less than 10 seconds, typed with a cadence that made my skin crawl. "You always liked your coffee with 2 sugars and a pinch of salt, because you said it cut the bitterness, Sarah," the message read. A secret Mark had shared with me during our first week of dating, and had never told anyone else. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, as Julian's typing bubble flickered again, followed by a photo of a small, jagged scar on a forearm. A scar Mark had gotten from a broken bottle during our honeymoon in Amalfi. The skin in the photo was tan and muscular, belonging to this stranger named Julian. But the mark was an exact replica of the trauma my husband had carried, right down to the 3 stitch marks at the base. The Julian on the screen wasn't just a man who knew things. He was a man who was Mark, trapped behind a face that belonged to someone else. A glitch in the very concept of identity. I agreed to meet him at the pier where Mark and I used to watch the fog roll in, my mind racing through theories of witness protection, secret government surgeries, or something far more sinister involving the tech conglomerate that owned SoulLink. When he arrived, he walked with that same slight hitch in his right hip, a vestige of an old college football injury. But when he stood before me, the eyes that looked into mine were a vibrant, synthetic green that felt like they were recording my every blink. He didn't say hello. He just reached out and took my hand, and the way his thumb rubbed against my knuckles, a specific rhythmic pressure, sent a jolt of recognition through me that no logic could argue with. "I know I don't look like him, Sarah, but I remember the way the air felt when the plane went down," he whispered, his voice a baritone rasp that was a half octave deeper than Mark's, yet the inflection on my name was perfect. He began to describe the last things Mark had seen. The flickering instrument panel, the scent of hydraulic fluid, and the terrifying silence of the engines, details that had never been released to the public or the families. He claimed he woke up in a sterile white room 6 months ago with this new face, new memories of a life as Julian, but with Mark's consciousness screaming underneath the surface like a prisoner in a high-tech cell. He told me that SoulLink wasn't a dating app at all, but a reconnection portal for a project called the Chimera Initiative, which specialized in recycling high-value minds into new, healthy bodies for clients who weren't ready to let go of their assets. As we spoke, I realized the horrifying truth. The app hadn't matched me with a new lover. It had flagged me as a stability variable to see if the new body could withstand the emotional stress of its past life. Julian, or Mark, grabbed my arm, his grip tightening as he checked his own smartwatch, which was flashing a rhythmic red light that seemed to pulse in time with the server hum I remembered from the warehouse mystery. "They're watching the telemetry, Sarah. They need to know if the biological match triggers a full memory integration or a system rejection," he hissed, his eyes darting toward a black van idling at the edge of the pier. He wasn't a man who had been saved. He was a piece of proprietary hardware that had developed a bug called love, and the company was coming to patch the system by deleting us both. I felt a wave of nausea as I looked at the stranger's face, trying to find my husband in the alien architecture of his cheekbones, realizing that the man I loved was being held hostage in a biological suit he didn't own. The van door slid open, and men in gray tactical gear stepped out, but they weren't carrying guns. They were carrying tablet devices and localized EMP emitters. "Run," the man who was Mark whispered, handing me a small encrypted drive he had pulled from the lining of his jacket.
"This has the DNA source files for the other matches. I'm not the only one they brought back." I realized then that the city was likely full of these 99% matches, a silent army of recycled souls living in stolen bodies, all managed by an algorithm that traded in the one thing humans can't resist: a second chance. I took the drive and bolted toward the stairs, the sound of his struggle echoing behind me as the Soul Link technicians swarmed the man who had my husband's heart, but a stranger's face. As I reached my car, my phone buzzed with one final notification from the app: match terminated, quality control in progress. I looked back to see the pier empty, the black van gone, and the only evidence that Mark had ever returned was the lingering scent of his favorite cologne, which Julian hadn't been wearing, but which I could swear was now clinging to my own skin. The 99% match was a trap, a biological lure designed to test the durability of a soul, and I was now the only person who knew that the dead weren't resting. They were being re-uploaded. I drove through the night, the encrypted drive burning a hole in my pocket, as I realized that the Soul Link app on my phone was no longer a dating tool, but a tracking device. I pulled over at a neon-lit truck stop, my hands shaking as I forced myself to delete the app, though I knew the digital stain of my biometric data was already etched into their servers. The drive contained a directory of thousands of names, each paired with a legacy ID and a current vessel ID, confirming my worst fears. The elite of the city weren't just hiring staff. They were buying the recycled souls of their departed loved ones. It was a market for ghosts, and Mark, or whatever was left of him inside Julian, was just a prototype for a new line of eternal partners meant to be sold to the highest bidder.
I spent the next 3 days in a motel room that smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap bleach, using a burner laptop to navigate the drive's labyrinthine folders. I found the Sarah folder, and my blood turned to ice when I saw the stability goal they had set for me. The company wasn't just testing the body. They were testing me to see how long it took for a widow to accept a replacement. There were hidden camera logs from my own house, recorded through my smart TV and laptop, documenting every time I cried over Mark's old sweaters. They had used my grief as a baseline to calibrate Julian's behavior, ensuring his re-entry would be as seamless as possible to maximize the emotional bond. The drive also revealed a harvest list, a catalog of healthy individuals whose lives were being quietly ended in accidents to provide the vessels for these high-value mines. Julian's body had belonged to a 30-year-old drifter named Julian Vance, who had checked into a hospital for a routine surgery and never checked out. The horror of it was a physical weight. For Mark to live, Julian had to be erased, and the company was playing God with a surgical laser and a cloud server. I realized that if I didn't act, Mark would be recalibrated, his memories of our love wiped to make him a more compliant, marketable product for the next woman on the list. I reached out to a contact I found on the drive, a whistleblower named Echo, who turned out to be a former Soul Link engineer living in a basement apartment in the city's industrial district. He explained that the 99.9% match wasn't a miracle. It was a biological lock-and-key mechanism where the soul was forcibly bonded to the nervous system through a series of painful neural links. "The body eventually rejects the consciousness," Echo whispered, showing me gruesome photos of previous chimeras whose skin had begun to necrotize as their brains fought the foreign hardware. Mark's green eyes, those synthetic-looking things I saw at the pier, were actually high-tech cameras designed to monitor his brain activity and keep the soul rejection at bay. Echo and I spent 48 hours building a neural virus, a digital pathogen that would scramble the Soul Link servers and break the bonds between the uploaded minds and their corporate controllers. It wouldn't kill the men and women in the vessels, but it would give them their autonomy back, allowing their own consciousness to merge naturally or fade away without being a slave to a remote control patch. The risk was that once the link was broken, the vessels might wake up as a confused blend of two people, a psychological cocktail that could lead to total madness. But I looked at Mark's digital file, seeing his soul being sliced into billable hours, and I knew that a messy, confused freedom was better than a perfect, polished prison. We tracked Julian's location to a reintegration center, disguised as a luxury wellness spa on the outskirts of the city, a place where the wealthy went to meet their new old friends. I walked through the front doors wearing a stolen technician's badge, my heart hammering a rhythm of pure defiance against the soft ambient music playing in the lobby. I found the server room behind a wall of glass and waterfalls, the air chilled to an unnatural degree to keep the massive processors from melting under the weight of 10,000 stolen lives. I plugged the drive into the master console, my fingers hovering over the execute key as a familiar voice called out my name from the doorway. It was Julian, but he was strapped into a vertical gantry, wires snaking from the base of his skull into the ceiling, his green eyes glowing with a terrifying intensity. "Sarah, don't do it," he gasped, his voice now a flickering, distorted mess that jumped between Mark's warmth and a cold, synthetic drone. "If you break the link, I won't know who I am anymore. I'll just be a ghost in a stranger's head." I looked at him, seeing the sweat on his brow and the agony in his eyes, and I realized that the company was using his fear to protect their investment. He wasn't afraid of losing himself. He was being programmed to fear the very thing that would set him free. "Mark, if you're in there, you know that this isn't living," I said, stepping toward him, despite the red warning lights beginning to flash on the walls. I reached out and touched his cheek, the skin feeling feverish and tight, and for a split second, the green glow in his eyes faded, replaced by the hazel warmth I had mourned for 3 years. "Let me go, Sarah," he whispered, a genuine tear tracking through the tan makeup they had applied to his new face. In that moment, I knew he wasn't asking me to stop the virus. He was asking me to end the simulation of our marriage so he could finally rest, even if his body stayed behind. I slammed my hand down on the keyboard, and the world seemed to scream in digital agony as the neural virus tore through the facility's network. The servers behind the glass erupted in a shower of sparks, and the legacy IDs on the monitors began to dissolve into a chaotic static of raw data. Julian's body lurched against the straps as the high-tech link was severed, the green light in his eyes shattering like a glass bulb, leaving him in total darkness. Across the wellness spa, other matches were collapsing, their corporate leashes cut, their minds finally returning to their own control for the first time in years. I unstropped him, catching his heavy, limp body before he hit the floor, the smell of ozone and burnt hair filling the small room. He looked up at me, his eyes now a muddy, natural brown, and he blinked with a confusion that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Who are you?" he asked, his voice now entirely his own, the baritone rasp of Julian Vance returning without the Mark inflection. I felt a sharp, jagged pain in my chest, the final realization that my husband was truly gone this time. But as I looked into the eyes of the man I had saved, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had saved Julian's life, and in doing so, I had finally honored Mark's death. We escaped through the service entrance just as the private security teams arrived, their tactical gear useless against a building that no longer had a functioning brain. I drove Julian to a hospital 3 towns over, leaving him in the care of nurses who wouldn't ask about soul links or biometric matches. I didn't leave a note or a name. I just watched from the doorway for a moment as he fell into a natural, dreamless sleep. A man who had been a vessel and was now just a human being again. The 99% match was over, the algorithm was dead, and the world was once again filled with people who were allowed to be themselves. I returned to my own home, the house that had been a hunting ground for Soulink, and I began the process of truly moving on. I smashed the smart TV, I threw the laptop into the lake, and I sat in the silence of a home that was no longer being monitored by a stability variable. I
realized that love isn't a biological marker or a DNA sequence. It's a choice made in the present, not a ghost summoned from the past. I looked at the photo of Mark on the mantle, and for the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel the need to reach out and touch it. The Soulink scandal broke a week later, the Chimera Initiative becoming the focus of a global criminal investigation that made the Eterna collapse look like a minor accounting error. Thousands of matches were identified, and a new branch of law was created to deal with the identity rights of those whose bodies had been hijacked. I didn't testify this time. I had seen enough of the inside of those machines to last a lifetime. I preferred the anonymity of the shadows, a woman who had seen the afterlife and decided that this life was the only one that mattered. 1 year later, I was sitting in a park when a man sat on the bench next to me, a man with familiar green eyes that had been replaced with simple, clear glasses. It was Julian, his face scarred from the surgery to remove the neural links, but his expression was one of genuine, quiet curiosity. "I don't know why, but I felt like I should find you," he said, his voice hesitant and kind. I looked at him and smiled, not because he was Mark, but because he was a new person I was meeting for the very first time. "My name is Sarah," I said, holding out my hand, ready to start a story that didn't have a percentage attached to it. We sat in the sun and talked about nothing important, the weather, the birds, the taste of the air, and for the first time since the plane went down, I wasn't looking for a match. I was just living. The months that followed were a surreal exercise in rebuilding a world that had been shattered by digital alchemy. Julian and I didn't rush into a romance. That would have been its own kind of haunting. But we became pillars for one another, two people who had survived the same shipwreck from opposite ends. He struggled with residual echoes, brief flashes of Mark's memories that would flicker through his mind like heat lightning, but we learned to treat them as symptoms of a fever that was finally breaking. I helped him navigate the legal nightmare of reclaiming his identity, proving to a skeptical government that Julian Vance was a man, not a corporate asset. The Soulink headquarters remained a hollowed-out shell in the center of the city, a glass tomb that no one dared to enter. Yet the technology they pioneered hadn't entirely vanished. I began to hear whispers on the dark web of the Patchwork, a decentralized version of the Chimera Initiative that was being run by rogue engineers in international waters. They weren't just bringing back husbands anymore. They were selling elite skill sets, allowing billionaires to buy the muscle memory of world-class athletes and the intellect of deceased Nobel laureates. It was a new kind of colonialism, one where the wealthy didn't just own the land, they owned the very biology of the poor. I realized my neural virus had been a cure for the symptoms, but not the disease of human greed. I spent my nights back in front of a screen, not as a victim this time, but as a digital shepherd, tracking the data leaks that pointed to these new soul farms. Julian sat across from me, his new life as a carpenter providing a grounded contrast to my war with the invisible. He didn't have Mark's hazel eyes or his laugh, but he had a quiet strength that was entirely his own, a soul that had fought its way back from the brink of deletion. One evening, we received a package with no return address, containing a single high-fidelity audio cassette, a technology so old it was almost unhackable. I found an old player, and as the tape hissed to life, the voice of the real Mark filled the room,
recorded just moments before his plane went down. He hadn't just been a victim, he had known the crash was coming because he had been the one to whistleblow on the original Chimera blueprints. Sarah, if they try to bring me back, don't look for me in the eyes of a stranger. His voice crackled through the static, sounding weary but resolved. The soul isn't a code you can copy-paste, Mark's voice continued. It's the space between the notes, the things we didn't say, the way we chose to love despite the ending. Julian listened beside me, his hand resting on my shoulder, and for the first time he didn't flinch at the sound of the man who had occupied his mind. We sat in the dark as the tape ran out, the silence that followed feeling like a holy thing, a boundary line that the tech giants could never cross. It was the final permission I needed to stop looking backward and start looking at the man sitting right in front of me. We decided to leave the city for good, moving to a remote area where the cellular signal was weak, and the smart cities of the future were just a distant, glowing threat on the horizon. I burned the SoulLink drive in a small fire behind our new house, watching the secrets of 10,000 lives turn into harmless ash and smoke. I realized that the only way to protect the sanctity of life was to let it be temporary again, to embrace the beauty of a story that has a final page. Julian watched the embers with me, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight, a man who was no longer a match, but a masterpiece of survival. I started a small foundation for identity survivors, helping the thousands of chimeras who had been abandoned when the servers crashed. We provided therapy, legal aid, and most importantly, a community for those who woke up in bodies they didn't recognize. It was a slow, painful process of rehumanization, teaching people how to own their skin again without the guidance of an algorithm. I became known as the anchor, the woman who helped the ghosts find their way back to the shore of the living. Julian became a master craftsman, his hands creating furniture that would last for generations, a physical legacy that didn't require a power source. He never asked to be Mark, and I never asked him to try. We built something new, a connection forged in the fires of a shared trauma that was stronger than any biological synchrony. Occasionally, someone would walk into his shop and pause, sensing a familiar vibe they couldn't place, but he would just smile and offer them a chair. He was the living proof that a vessel could become a home. The world eventually moved on to new scandals, new technologies, and new ways to lose ourselves, but our little corner of the world remained offline and intact. I kept the analog tape in a safe, not to listen to it, but just to know that the truth was there, recorded in magnetic dust rather than digital light. I realized that the 99% match was the ultimate lie, because love is always the 1% that can't be measured, the unpredictable, the messy, and the divine. On the 5th anniversary of the crash, Julian and I climbed a mountain overlooking the ocean, the air cold and crisp in our lungs. We didn't bring phones, we didn't bring cameras, and we didn't broadcast our location to a cloud. We just stood at the summit, two humans who had outrun the afterlife, and watched the sun set over the water. "I'm glad I found you, Sarah," Julian said, his voice steady and warm, and for the first time, I didn't compare it to anyone else's. "I'm glad you found yourself, Julian," I replied, taking his hand as the stars began to poke through the deepening blue of the sky. The world below was a grid of lights and signals, a web of data trying to catch the souls of the unwary. But up here, we were invisible to the machines. We were just two people, breathing together, in a moment that would never be uploaded and could never be deleted. I thought about the Sarah override in the neural virus, and I realized that the best way to fight the machine wasn't to crash the system, but to live a life that the system couldn't comprehend. We were the untrackables. The ones who lived outside the margins of the 99 could trust was physical presence. I watched from my quiet sanctuary as the legal battles over SoulLink dragged on, resulting in the Digital Habeas Corpus Act, which strictly forbade the rehosting of human consciousness without a dozen physical witnesses and a paper trail of consent. My foundation became the gold standard for verifying originality, helping people confirm that the person sitting across from them was a continuous soul, not a remanufactured copy. Julian served as the face of the movement, his scars a testament to the fact that being human is a birthright, not a subscription service. I eventually received a letter from a young man who had been a vessel for a tech billionaire's son. He described the sensation of the billionaire's memories fading away like a receding tide, leaving behind a shoreline of his own forgotten childhood. He thanked me for the virus, saying that for the first time in 3 years, he could taste his food without feeling like he was stealing the flavor from a dead man. It was these letters that kept me going, the tangible proof that the 1% of unpredictability was reclaiming the world, one person at a time. I archived every letter in a fireproof safe, creating a library of reclaimed lives that would never be digitized or indexed by a search engine. Julian began carving a series of wooden sculptures that didn't look like people, but felt like emotions, jagged pieces for grief, smooth flowing arcs for peace, and heavy, grounded blocks for resilience. He sold them to galleries in the city, but he always refused to give interviews or allow his work to be featured in virtual reality showrooms. "If you want to feel the wood, you have to stand in the room with it," he would say, a philosophy that became a quiet rebellion against a society that was still trying to move everything into the cloud. We became the center of a local off-grid movement, where neighbors traded eggs for advice on how to build Faraday cages for their bedrooms. One winter, a massive solar flare hit the Earth, a Carrington-level event that knocked out satellite communications and wiped the majority of unshielded cloud servers in an afternoon. While the rest of the world plunged into a panic over lost data and reintegration failures, Julian and I sat by our fireplace, reading books by candlelight and listening to the wind. The soul farms in international waters were decimated, their remote control links severed forever by the sun itself, a natural Sarah override that did more damage than any virus I could have written. It was as if the universe was finally helping us clean up the digital mess we had made, a cosmic reset that leveled the playing field for the living. In the aftermath of the blackout, the Chimera scandals finally died out, not because people stopped being greedy, but because the infrastructure for immortality had become too fragile to trust. People began to value the temporary again, the now becoming more precious than the forever, and the dating apps returned to being simple tools for connection rather than soul-matching algorithms. I saw a group of teenagers in town playing a game where they had to find each other using only paper maps and handwritten clues, and I felt a surge of hope I hadn't felt since before Mark's plane went down. We were learning to be analog again, to trust our instincts over our interfaces. Julian and I never got married, not in the legal sense, because we didn't want our union to be a data point in a government registry. We simply existed together, our commitment written in the way we looked after each other during the flu, the way we shared the garden chores, and the way we sat in silence on the porch. He was the most unmatched person I had ever known, and that was exactly why I loved him. He was a constant surprise, a person who could change it.
His mind grow and fail without being recalibrated. We were two separate lives, walking the same path by choice, not by biological design. As I reached my 60s, I noticed that my own memories of Mark were beginning to soften at the edges, the sharp pain of his loss turning into a dull, comforting hum of a life well lived. I didn't fear forgetting him anymore. I realized that forgetting is a vital part of the human experience, a way of clearing space for the new people and moments that deserve our attention. The Soul Link philosophy had tried to make grief a permanent, solvable problem, but they had missed the point. Grief is the price we pay for love, and it's meant to be paid in full, not deferred through technology. I was finally debt-free, a woman who had mourned her husband and moved into the next chapter of her own story. Julian's hair turned a distinguished silver, and his hands, once the tools a stranger, had become the most familiar things in my world. We would sit on the beach and talk about the 99.9% match as if it were a legend from a distant land, a ghost story we told to remind ourselves why we were lucky to be old and gray. He would often joke that he was glad he wasn't a 100% match, because that would have been boring, and I would laugh, knowing that the missing 0.1% was where all the magic lived.
We were the anomalies in the system, the errors that made the equation beautiful. On the 10th anniversary of the solar flare, the world had mostly recovered, but the new analog movement had become a permanent fixture of society. There were no more chimeras, no more Project Afterlives, and the tech companies were now legally required to prove that their AIs were entirely synthetic, with no human data harvesting involved. I felt like a
soldier who had survived a war that nobody else quite remembered, but the peace was worth the anonymity. I had helped save the soul of a generation by burning the bridges to the past. One day, while walking through a local park, I saw a young couple sitting on a bench, the girl showing the boy a locket with a physical photo inside. She wasn't swiping or tapping, she was just holding a piece of paper, and the look of pure, unrecorded joy on her face was better than any 4K resolution. I smiled at them as I passed, feeling like a silent guardian of their simplicity, a witness to the victory of the mundane. I realized then that my work was truly done. The world was safe for the temporary again. Julian and I spent our final years in that cottage, the walls covered in his sculptures and my archived letters, a physical record of 2 lives that had refused to be digitized. When he finally passed away, quietly in his sleep, from a heart that had simply run its course, there was no GPS ghost, no companion app, and no secret lab waiting to harvest his thoughts. There was only a quiet house, a grieving friend, and a body that was allowed to return to the earth as nature intended. I sat with him for a long time, holding his hand and thanking him for the years of being Julian, a man who was more than enough. I buried him in the garden under a willow tree, and I didn't feel the need to track his pulse or look for him in a server rack. I knew exactly where he was. He was in the furniture he built, the people he helped, and the memory of the woman who had saved him. I lived for another 5 years, a peaceful coda to a dramatic life, spending my days writing by hand and watching the tide come in and out. I was the last of the Sarah overrides, the final keeper of the kill codes, and I took them with me when my own time finally came. I died on a warm summer evening, my eyes fixed on the sunset, my heart beating its last natural
Rhythm without a single digital interference. There was no backup, no cloud storage, and no Project Afterlife waiting to reboot my consciousness for a fee. I simply stopped being Sarah, leaving behind a world that was a little more human because of the choices I had made. The match was finally, perfectly, 0%. The screen of the world went dark, and for the first time in history, nobody tried to turn it back on. In the end, I chose to leave the drive on the dashboard of my car, parked right in front of the ruins of the SolLink facility, letting the heavy rain soak into the circuits until the data was nothing but a mess of copper and plastic. I walked away without looking back, realizing that the most rebellious thing I could do in a world obsessed with eternal optimization was to simply age, to forget, and to let things die. My husband's soul wasn't in a server or a stranger's eyes. It was in the quiet, unrecorded years we had shared, a legacy that required no power source and no subscription fee. I moved to a place where the stars weren't drowned out by the glow of a city, living a life that was deliberately, beautifully offline. Julian, or the man who used to be him, settled in a nearby town, and sometimes we'd pass each other on the street, sharing a nod of mutual recognition that needed no digital verification. We were 2 survivors of a future that tried to steal the ending of our stories, but as I sat on my porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I knew the truth. Life is precious only because it is temporary, and I was finally content to let my story end exactly where it was meant to, in the silence of a life well lived.